Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Tuesday evening Camberley Chess Club Zoom meeting. It's actually our 95th meeting, starting in March 2020. And it's our pleasure tonight to have Grandmaster Michael Adams coming back to us. Michael was with us in April last year and went through a few games and did some Q&A, and hopefully he's going to do the same sort of thing again. So let me pass over to him and thank him for joining us yet again. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. Yeah, I'm going to start off with a couple of related games that I played only a few days apart, going back quite a long time, actually. Until 1999, and it was a very unusual sequence. I played the first game in the last round of a group of games in the French League. It was the third game, and then I travelled on directly to Linares to play the Super Tournament there. And in the first round, I was white again in that game against Peter Lecco. And I think we played about the first 15 moves or so in both games were identical. I won actually both games, and I always thought that actually I had good preparation and a very good position in the opening, and it was actually interesting to look back at them, but the computer doesn't actually see many problems for black. But they're both quite sharp tactical games. I think last time I showed something a bit more strategical. But I hope that you'll find them interesting. So I'm going to show them in sequential order, starting with the one played first. And so I was white in the first game against Jordi Margan, a strong grandmaster from Spain. And he was a regular player of this Caro-Kann line that we played in the game, and I think that possibly I had done some kind of preparation for this. So I went for knight d2, one of the main lines, and he liked to play the line with bishop f5, the old classical line. I continued the game, knight g3, very standard stuff, bishop g6, h4, h6, knight f3. And now he played a slightly less common line here. He played knight f6. The main line here is knight d7, preventing knight e5. And, well, one typical continuation would be h5, bishop h7, bishop d3, takes. And, well, black has just a choice of where to castle in this position, but quite often they look to go queen c7 and castle queenside. It is possible to castle kingside as well, but in some ways the move knight f6 is more committal, because it allows white the possibility just to put the knight into e5, and after this it's going to be a lot more difficult for black to castle queenside. He's likely to be committing his king to the king side, which is a bit risky with white's pawn already advanced to h4 and black committed to move h6. But we'll see that as the game develops. So I went knight e5, which seems like the critical move. If white was to continue h5 and play, well, just as if black had played knight d7, thinking that the game could transpose, it gives black some other options. For instance, takes, e6, bishop d2. Here black would be able to play c5, castles queenside, knight c6, another major theoretical line. Knight e5 seems to me the critical test for the system of knight f6. Black's pretty much forced to drop the bishop back. And then I continued with bishop d3. And he captured the bishop. It's not possible here, actually. The queen takes d4 because of knight takes f7, and it takes, black's losing his queen, and bishop takes d3. I can capture the rook on h8, and the knight can always find an escape route with h5 if required. Black doesn't have to capture immediately. Some inventive players have also tried to move knight bd7 here, which is a bit confusing, but I think this is probably not especially good. After bishop takes h7, it's not clear how black should recapture. Knight takes h7 isn't really ideal, as the knight would have to come back to f6 later on in the game. Knight takes e5 is another move, which was once played against me by Kenkin, but with the idea d takes e5, this queen a5 check. White only really has one move to prevent queen takes e5 check, king f1, but the displacement of the king is less important here than the fact that white is able to play e6, and this really jams up black's pawns on the king side, makes it very hard to get into the game. So the main move due to this is to capture on d3, and I recaptured with the queen. He played again the main line, the most flexible move, e6, preparing to develop his bishop. If black was to play knight bd7 here, this is quite risky. It could transpose, but white also has some other good options, like knight g6. Taking this isn't a particularly good idea. But if black tries to get tricky with knight c5, something like queen e2 takes is pretty good for white. Again, black's pawns on the king side have been quite badly compromised. So he continued with e6, and I played perhaps the most aggressive move, bishop d2, getting ready to castle queenside, which in general is part of white's plans in these positions. It is possible instead to play bishop f4, which in some ways looks more aggressive because the bishop is quite actively placed, but black has some tricky responses to this. Often black plays queen a5 check, and after c3 offers the exchange of queens, which doesn't really fit in with white's plans. White's looking really to build an attack in this position. Black set up his structure in a very reliable way, so white really needs to try and to use the space advantage and leading development factors that are not going to be so great in the endgame. So it's another possible way to play, but I think the way that I played is a bit more critical. Bishop d2. Now c5 doesn't look so good because queen b5 check looks a problem for black. So he played knight bd7, challenging my knight, and the exchange of knights would also mean the exchange of queens, so it's obviously something that white can't allow. I played an ambitious move, which was part of my plans. I wanted to reinforce the knight on e5, and also to hope to use my f-pawn as an aggressive piece later on in the game, perhaps looking to advance it to f5. It's also possible for white here just to play queen e2. I was checking the database a little bit today, and I saw Jan Nepomniachtchi won a very nice game with white in this position in the World Rapid Championships. It may be worth checking out if you're interested in this line. But it's another possible move, but of course white loses a little bit of time by moving the queen again. So it's hard to say which is more convenient. It's useful to get the queen off the d file, so that when white castles queenside, the rook will be powerfully placed there. As mentioned before, after f4, queen c7 doesn't make that much sense now. After castles queenside, it's still not possible to castle queenside for black. Taking on e5 is definitely not a good idea. After something like takes, knight d5, castles, queen c7, knight e4. White really is a very nice position. Knight on g3, which is probably white's problem piece in this line, has come back to a very strong central square, and there's going to be a lot of pressure against the pawn on f7 when white's rooks come to the f5. There are a couple of decent alternatives to bishop e7. Sometimes black chooses to put the bishop to d6 instead. That's another possibility. Black's still looking to play with c5, but sometimes the bishop can challenge the knight on e5. And the immediate c5 is also a possible move. It's a pretty risky move to make. Black's already somewhat lagging in development, so I think that's quite a brave choice. Bishop e7 seems more logical. Looking to complete development before playing c5, which is really black's standard plan in this line. So I castled queenside and he castled kingside. So perhaps this is a good moment to take stock. Both kings are now on opposite wings, and white's plans really involve now about looking to build an attack on the king side. To that end, normally a pawn storm would be a kind of very desirable way to go about this. I've already actually made the moves f4 and h4 here, so if it was possible for the g pawn to kind of join and move forward, that would be perfect. But of course, at the moment, my knight on g3 is in the way, and it's not so easy to see how to resolve this problem. Knight e4, swapping it off, makes a certain amount of sense, but there's a drawback to this move. If black captures, f takes, knight takes, queen takes, black has the strong move queen d5, and as well as challenging my queen, the pawn on a2 is on prise. So I might have to swap queens, which is not what I'm looking for. Then the half-open c-file could also be quite useful for black's rooks, and is not so easy to get an initiative going with reduced material. Another option for white to move the knight out of the way would be just to move the knight back to e2. This isn't completely satisfactory anyway. Really, I want to move my pieces forward, not backwards. But it is nonetheless quite sharp, because it's not so easy for black to prevent g4 happening. Even if this costs a pawn, if it means that I open the g file, it might well not be a big deal to lose a pawn to open lines against the black king. If black does play h5, trying to secure the g4 square, this probably doesn't work out particularly well for black. It looks quite dangerous to me to play like this, but it's possible. Probably the best move is simply to play c5 immediately, challenging the center. And well, one sharp line could continue g4. Knight takes e5, takes, knight takes g4, rook g1, h5, knight f4, hitting the pawn on h5. Black can't really defend here. He should look to capture on d4 and swap queens. So white can regain the material, but with the swap of queens, nothing clear. So knight e2, again, for me, it's a bit too committal in this position. If I just make a useful move here, like for instance king b1, then black's going to play c5, and actually now I'm starting to have some problems in the center. C takes d4 is coming quite fast, and once the pawn on d4 is undermined, then my knight on e5 is no longer so well supported. I have to be looking to make some quick actions. The move in the game which I played was queen e2, looking to get the queen out of the way and open up my rook down the d file. But looking back at the game again, I was thinking that in fact perhaps this was not the most precise square for my queen. And in fact, queen f3 might have been a stronger continuation. This has the advantage of of preventing c5 because the pawn on b7 is hanging, and so black probably has to make another preparatory move before going ahead with c5, which gives white quite a few options. For instance, if black plays queen c7, which looks quite logical to defend the pawn, white has a couple of good options. One idea, which now could be quite dangerous, is to play knight e2, c5, g4, giving up a pawn. But now I'm really getting to play g5, and this is really a dangerous pawn move for black, because now, due to the hook on h6, there's going to be a breach on the king side, which is very difficult to meet. White also has some other possible moves after queen c7. One interesting idea is to go c5. This looks quite strange initially, because it doesn't seem to make much sense to move the pawn in front of white's own king. But the idea is if black now plays c5, white responds d5, and black has a tricky choice here. Knight takes e5, takes, queen takes is not possible, because bishop f4 actually traps the black queen in the middle of the board. But if instead black plays e takes d5, which seems quite logical, then knight f5 is extremely dangerous. There are ideas of queen g3, the bishop on e7 is hanging, lots of attackers jumping in. So actually I think queen f3 was the most dangerous move for black in this position. And in fact it's quite logical, because when I mentioned on the earlier move where I played f4 that I could have played queen e2, if I wanted to play queen e2, then perhaps I should have done so immediately without committing to f4 immediately. But this f4, queen f3 setup strikes me as quite harmonious. So anyway, back in the game, instead I chose to play queen e2. And now he responded with the best move, c5. And it's quite important for black in these positions not to be too scared of kind of phantom threats down the d file. I mean, by going c5, you are putting the black queen in opposition to white's rook down the d file, which is not ideal, but there's not so much pressure down the d file, and it's very important that black moves fast here. Events are going to develop quickly in this very sharp middle game position, and black doesn't really want to be making preparatory moves unless they're absolutely necessary, like in the queen f3 line that we saw. So if black does play, for instance, queen c7, there are a few options for white, but if we make, let's say, just a useful move, king b1, c5, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, the problem is that black's already made two moves with the queen to get it to d7, and after something like takes, bishop c3, lots of my moves coming with tempo now, queen e7, takes, knight e4, queen e7. White's got a very pleasant position. One good option, white could look to just push forward on the king side with g4, g5 here. Another good option is to play queen b5, d6, rook d7, and suddenly white has complete control of the board. So black has to be consequent here and challenge in the center immediately with c5. There are a few options here. In the end, I ended up playing d takes c5. Let's perhaps look at the lesser options first. Something like knight takes d7, queen takes d7, d takes c5, a bit like the line we just looked at, is much less effective here. Now effectively I'm just moved down without king b1. So for instance, one option for black would be to play aggressively with queen a4 hitting a2 and then recapture the pawn. If I push onwards now with f5, black's got a number of good moves, but one option, decent option, might be queen g4, forcing the exchange of queens, a kind of favourable outcome for black. Pushing on with f5 actually looks quite tempting, but it's not really so dangerous. Black can capture on d4, and if white continues with f takes e6, with the idea of f e6, knight g6, black can capture on e5, queen takes e5, and again queen d5. You can see we've already actually seen a number of variations where this loose pawn on a2 has caused problems for me. It's this kind of in this kind of sharp position, these small kind of tactical details are very important. Would be nice to have the king on b1, but there's just not really enough time to get it there in this position. There is actually one other extremely interesting continuation here. It didn't occur to me at all during the game, although I think we have seen the idea somewhat in subsequent games, not in this exact position, but which is to play d5. This looks like an absolutely crazy move, just giving up the pawn, giving black two opportunities to capture it. But it's actually a very, very dangerous move for black. One advantage to this as well is that actually the pawn on c5 now in some ways gets in black's way. The bishop on e7, the knight on c5, they both would find it useful to access this square on c5. So in a way, this move also kind of blocks black's pieces. The most it's a bit unclear as to say which is the most obvious move in a way. Knight takes d5 looks a bit dangerous due to the pressure down the d file, but it doesn't obviously come to anything if white just continues it directly in that way. But white has an amazing idea, which this was, I have to admit, this line was basically almost all from the computer. Knight h5. This is already somewhat dangerous for black. For instance, if he was to capture on e5, f takes e5, something like queen c7, bishop takes e6, h6 is already very strong. Even a stronger move for black like c4 here, trying to give up the pawn to get more active. White should probably prevent c3, but white has plenty of time to take time out. The threat of queen g4 is still quite a problem. Black plays king h8 to defend. White can put a rook to the f file, so that after queen g4, rook g8, I can capture on f7. Still quite a dangerous position for black. If white tries something like knight 5 f6, then bishop c3 is very strong. Now black has real problems down the d file. The most obvious move is to bring the other knight to f6 to exchange the knight on h5 before white comes with queen g4. But now white has another very spectacular and amazing continuation here. Simply to take on g7, and after king g7, just to continue g4. White's a whole piece down here, but the opening up of black's king has been incredibly dangerous. And the big problem for black here really is that g5 is a very, very strong threat. It's very hard to prevent this opening lines on the king side, and almost all white's pieces, or perhaps all white's pieces, are just ready to join in the attack on the king side. In particular, white's major pieces, both rooks and queen, could easily be in the action, and black's king can just get overwhelmed very quickly. I'll show one sample line. Knight d7 looks to me like a very logical move to try and exchange the powerful knight on e5. White continues g5. If black tries to block things now with h5, takes, knight takes e5, white has the nasty intermediate check, queen h6, king g8, f takes e5, and now just g6 is coming either, well, probably immediately or after queen e8. White can prepare this with rook g1, and it's quickly going to be mate. If black captures the knight instead, white's able to capture with check. This is actually one of the better defenses for black. Black should probably actually play f6 here. Queen takes e6, white's now regained a pawn, but white's still very much in the ascendancy. The attack's continuing, and the knight on d5 has now become a bit loose. Lots of possibilities for more pieces to join the attack. If black just dodges with his king, he's already in fact running into, well, losing immediately. After bishop c3, the knight can be captured because the queen's hanging, and then after rook g8, queen e4, there's no very good way to intercede. Rook g6, h5 is picking up the rook, and things are collapsing. So knight takes d5 is a very dangerous idea, but if black chooses the other capture, e takes d5, this is obviously nice in terms of black closing closing the d file, but it does, however, allow white's knight to come into f5. Kasparov, I think, once said that in positions, in attacking positions, that a knight on f5 can often be worth a pawn, and it's certainly true in this position that white has ample compensation. So rook e8 looks a logical way to continue, lining up against white's queen and giving the defensive idea of bishop f8. White can't go directly here. Something like queen f3, bishop f8, queen g3 doesn't really work. Black can capture on e5, put the knight to e4, attacking white's queen. Knight takes h6, king h7. There's not enough there. But again, this sacrifices again open up the possibilities of white get the pawn storm going, g4. And this is still not so easy for black to meet. Perhaps knight e4 is one idea that looks normal. g5 takes. But black still has a problem. h5 I can capture, so it's not so easy to keep things closed. If knight takes d2, queen takes. h5, it seems that black has at least managed to close the king side. Of course, white could play back on d5 with a good game, but in fact it's probably much stronger just to move all the major pieces over to the king side and look to open lines with the timing knight h6 sacrifice. I'll just give one sample line that I quite liked. Both rooks really powering down towards the black king now. Queen e6, looks like we had a sensible defensive move. Takes, and now white has a rather beautiful way to decoy the defenders. Perhaps we'll see if I can get that up in chat. I'm not. Yeah, we'll see if we can have some suggestions for white's move here. Got a good answer from Martin. We've actually got some other suggestions that look quite interesting. Got a lot of suggestions of rook f6, so let's just have a think about that a minute. Is it possible for white to play queen takes e5 after rook f6? The move I was actually looking for was g6, which is a really nice way just to cut black's queen out of the defense for a while, and then f takes g6, queen takes g6. Black can't play g5 because the black queen is undefended, and rook takes g6 is coming next. So a very thematic attack there with all white's pieces coming through. But to be honest, this line, as nice as it is really very much a computer-assisted line, not really the kind of thing that I think it's particularly easy to find at the board. So I played a more normal move, capturing on c5. And he made a good response here, capturing with the knight on c5. If bishop takes c5, we might actually transpose to a line that I mentioned earlier, king b1. And again, black's got the problem that it's not really possible to capture on e5 here without opening up the queen to a lot of fire down the d file. So queen c7, we might get the line that we mentioned earlier, which was rather favourable for white. So he captured with the knight instead. White has some discovered attacks, but nothing too dangerous at the moment. But I think that they are very much the best option for white. If I was to go f5, which looks in some ways quite tempting, again we'll see this recurring theme, queen d5 hitting the pawn on a2. I can actually play c4 here because of queen takes e5 and knight d3, which is definitely not good. And after king b1, knight ce4 looks to force some exchanges and also leaves my knight on e5 undefended. So I need to bring up more reinforcements before looking to move forward there. So I play bishop c3, discovering an attack on the black queen. So I mentioned earlier that I was showing two games that started in a very similar way. And this was actually the first moment. It's actually my white's 16th move that I've just played. And this was actually the moment where the two games diverged, but obviously this one was played first. And here my opponent made a move that I think was inaccurate. I think Hidaleko actually found a better move for black in this position. We should perhaps mention first of all that knight d5 is not ideal. It allows my knight to jump in to h5, which is again a very dangerous possibility. Queen g4 is coming. If black captures, queen g4 threatens mate, and I'm able to take his queen later on. g6 is already too dangerous. I can actually sacrifice on g6 here, queen e5, and it's not really possible to defend against the many threats there. If bishop f6 takes, rook takes d5 is material. And something like f5 is possible that I would have to move my bishop, but f5 of course is given even more possibilities to open lines on the king side. And it's not going to be long before white gets to play g takes f5 and put a rook on g1, which looks extremely dangerous. So as I mentioned in the other game, black played queen c7, but my opponent played queen b6. Perhaps we'll have a suggestion for white's move here. So I'm seeing a few suggestions. I haven't seen any that the game move yet. I mean, one idea for black here is to play knight a4. I think there's one suggestion of b3 to prevent that, but white's looking something a bit more active. Got a suggestion of knight c4. I'm also not huge on that move. Queen a6 would kind of I've got a correct suggestion from Alan. Knight c4, queen a6, again my a2 pawn I would have to defend, and the kind of opposition of queens between a6 and e2 might mean that there are good chances of a queen exchange later on. Also a correct answer from Andrew Smith. So I've had quite a few suggestions. Knight h5 has also been suggested. I think that's less effective than the move that I played in the game. I played knight g4, and the reason that this move is quite strong is that now I really actually get to open up my bishop, and it also gets out of the way of problems with knight a4, because now my bishop's ready to capture on f6. And the queen on b6 is actually now that it's moved to the queen side, black's king side is a bit more vulnerable to piece play. So for instance, if black was to drop the knight back to d7 here, white can play knight takes h6, g takes, rook takes. If black captures, queen g4, bishop g5 is the only way to prevent mate on g7. H takes g5, and the H and G files are get opened decisively. Black can try something else, perhaps for instance knight d5, but this also has a number of problems. There's more than one way for white to proceed here, but knight takes h6 with similar ideas. G takes h6 isn't possible. King h7. Then white's got the quite nice move knight hf5 with the idea that if black takes on c3, white can set up a mating combination like this. So it's quite a tricky move for black. I think my opponent, again, didn't make the best decision here. It's very easy to understand his decision when you're kind of calculating lines like the ones I just showed. You would think that it's a very good idea for black to try and get rid of queens at all costs. And the move he played was queen a6, aiming to do that. But probably he should have been a bit more resolute and simply taken the knight on g4. I didn't have a particularly high opinion of this move during the game. I thought this looked quite favourable for white, but it's probably not quite so bad for black as I thought. Black has to play f6, which looks a very ugly move. It's really the only way to stop problems on the king side. But although this certainly has flaws in terms of weakening a lot of light squares, it does at least block my bishop on c3 pretty effectively. So I'm not really going to be able to proceed with a direct attack. And white has the advantage. There are various ways to continue. I can just play kind of modestly, thinking something like perhaps bishop d4, pinning his knight, getting my bishop to a safer square, and then following up with rook he1. But the move that I was interested in during the game, and that actually I gave in my old notes for informant, was to continue with f5. As black doesn't really want the knight coming to f5 after an exchange of pawns, e5 seems indicated. And then I suggested knight h5, also looks quite logical. Rook f7, bishop d2. I gave king h8 here. And I gave, in fact, rook h3 with a large advantage to white. That is probably not a bad assessment. In fact, it may be even better for white to continue here with queen c4, which is quite a sneaky move. He's either got to get his rooks into a bit of a tangle with rook af8 or rook ff8. But now again, I have another very nice breakthrough. Knight takes g7, king takes, queen g4, king h8, and queen h5 or queen g6. It's very hard for him to defend the pawn on h6, but I'm capturing with check. And of course, there are possibilities for my rook to come into play and possibly combine with the queen in a mating attack. My bishop also is able to come in. But actually, when I was checking this, there's actually a very nice resource for black here. I mean, black actually has a few decent moves here, but there's well, for me, quite an amazing sacrificial idea. I don't know if anyone can actually come up with it for black here, now that I've perhaps given you a small hint with the sacrificial bit. Ideally, perhaps a two-move suggestion. Okay, we have one. Well, we certainly have the first part from some people. Very quickly. Knight d3. So after knight d3, c takes d3. The people. Yeah, okay. So actually, lots of people finding the follow-up. It's interesting doing so well with this. I thought this one would be harder. Black has some decent moves like rook c8, queen c6. There are a few possible moves for black, but the sacrificial idea that I was hinting at is knight d3, cd3, and bishop a3, which is a very nasty idea. White's problem is after b takes a3, rook c8 check, it's suddenly not at all easy to put pieces in the way of this. White queen c4 is clearly good for black. The bishop c3, lots of pieces are coming in. I mean, white doesn't have to take after b takes a3. Rook d1 is possible, but continuing this line a little bit, rook c8, king d1, queen takes b2. Well, according to the computer, here white has actually only one move to stay in the game, queen a4. And well, this position is supposed to be roughly equal. It certainly looks extremely dangerous for white. My king all over the place and all black's rooks in the game. So, in fact, after e5, white should play bishop d2 first, was a more precise move. king h8, knight h5, rook g8, king b1, and white has some advantage, but this was definitely a better possibility for black than the way that he played in the game, which was queen a6. This move is very forcing, and it does mean that he's able to liquidate to an endgame. Well, I'll make the first moves, forcing moves first. It doesn't really matter whether white plays queen takes a6 first or knight takes f6. It's going to come to the same kind of position. Black has a choice whether to capture with the knight or the pawn on a6. This isn't an easy decision. He chose to capture with the knight. The problem with this is that although he's been able to liquidate things to some extent, he's really given a lot of ground in terms of piece activities. My pieces are much more active in that situation, as we'll see in the game. But of course, b takes a6 looks a bit ugly. And after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, he's got quite a messy pawn structure. But I think now there's one particularly strong move for white. We'll perhaps have a suggestion for white's next move here. So we've had some suggestions of knight h5 or b4. I think white has a couple of possibilities that I would prefer to those moves. But there's one in particular that I think to me is extremely practical here. Lots of people have mentioned b4, which is certainly possible, but after knight a4, I'm not really sure that this is so great. Black's knight can jump around. I mean, possibly the knight can come to c3, where it's attacking a pawn. Might also be able to jump back to d5. Going after this pawn on a6 directly is not really a particularly valuable experience. A slightly better version of this might be rook d6, which I also don't think is the best move, but is possible. White is now ready to double on the d file, so black would probably, I think, here give up a pawn, fix the kingside structure, b4, knight a4. White can actually win a pawn here, but even here I wasn't so convinced. Again, black's knight is ready to come back to d5, where it hits these two pawns. And my rook on a6 has got a bit sidetracked. But the move that I like, which actually has been suggested by Philip and Camberley Chess Club, is f5. I really quite like this move. I think it's very important to fix the kingside structure. If black's able to play f5 in this position, its kingside structure is actually quite good. It potentially gives the knight an outpost on e4. It also means that my kingside pawns are much weaker. Maybe in the long term, black might be able to bring a rook to the g file. It also gives room for his king to advance up the board to g7, g6, or f6. And his kingside structure is really quite safe. So I actually very much like the move f5 here. It also creates the strong idea to play knight h5, which I think some people mentioned immediately. I don't like it so much immediately because then I believe black can play f5, and it's not that easy to follow up. Check isn't really going anywhere. And after knight h5, black has a bit of a problem to defend this pawn on f6. It's not easy to secure his knight on e4 now. It's no longer in a kind of secure position. So I think this is very much the strongest move here. We'll actually see this kind of similar idea in the game, because although he captured with it on a6 with the knight, I actually played the same plan. Again, but here it's actually perhaps even more clear cut, because rook d7 might appear tempting, but actually doesn't work at all, because after knight c5, rook c7, the rook is swapped and black's in fact solved all his problems and maybe even marginally better here. Knight h5 again, f5. Even if I look to play something like rook hg1 to play g4, rook fd8, black's now swapping a lot of material, and it's not so easy to actually get an initiative going on the king side with such reduced material remaining. The f5 plan is to some extent even stronger here now though, because black's knight on a6 is going to take a while to get back into the game. He played knight b4 again, using the idea of the loose a2 pawn to try and bring his knight back into the game with gain of time. Another possibility might be to go knight c5, and now perhaps we can see some of the ideas that I was mentioning. White might want to play something like knight h5, knight e4, rook hf1, lining up against the pawn on f6. And now black has a problem, but it's very hard to make any useful move, and white's just going to continue in the future with rook d1, the knight on e4. As I mentioned earlier, it's just not secure on this central square. White can always kick it away, and if black looks to play something like I don't know, some kind of fancy defense like this, there's going to be tactical possibilities with a fork on f6. So black could also consider something like rook fd8, but now already the problem is that the pawn on f6 can't be defended. Something like this takes, rook d6. Now we can see my knight and rook really combining well. That's a move like rook c8. My knight's able to jump back, and now we can see black's really been left with several weak pawns on the king side. So this f5 move was really, I think, an important move from a structural point of view, and also from a practical point of view. It's very, very difficult to defend these kind of positions with black, where you have all these weak pawns and the knight is jumping around. Really not easy at all. He went knight b4. I decided to give up the pawn on a2, or be willing to part with the pawn on a2 at least, and play for the initiative with knight h5. It was actually also, it was also possible just to continue with a normal move here, a3, knight d5, rook hg1, to continue with knight h5 next. But the move I played is also quite strong, so I just jumped in with knight h5 immediately. He probably now, I think, having played this knight b4, should have been consistent and taken the pawn on a2. It looks like it's costing quite a lot of time, but it is a possible way to play. It's certainly still not very pleasant for black. If king g7, check, takes, and again black's been left with these two very weak pawns, and at some moment white will either put a rook on the 7th, or after rook d8 takes, I kick his knight back before capturing the pawn on e6. Another alternative is to take on f5, but then c3, black has the problem that his knight no longer is able to go back to d5, can go to c6. White might even line up against the pawn on f5 before starting to capture things. Knight e7 now, rook d7 is available. A lot of black pawns dropping off, and the knight not very actively placed again. So he went back to d5. I was able to continue rook he1, increasing the pressure on e6. Black's already actually losing a pawn here. For instance, rook fe8 is not possible because I can capture on d5, takes, and knight takes f6, heading to a winning king and pawn ending. So he chose to go rook ad8, trying to secure the knight. Actually, here I didn't find the strongest continuation. I took on e6, but in fact, a good question to ask yourself here with the white pieces might be what is black's next move? And the answer is that there really is not a particularly good move available for black. There are a couple of ways to take advantage of this. One possibility is to play g4. which I quite like, just making a useful pawn move. Black can't play e5 or e takes f5 because the rook takes d5, but it's also difficult to make other rook moves. For instance, rook takes d7, rook takes d5, and a fork on f6. Rook d6, again, I can play knight takes f6. Rook fe8, again, there's rook takes d5 tactics. If black's play something like b5, you might think this is a useful move, but this, of course, also has its drawbacks, because if I continue as in the game, the move g4 is quite useful, but I also have the extra possibility now to play something like rook a6. This square wasn't available when the pawn was on b5. White also has another strong possibility here, which is a very similar idea, just rook d4. Again, just saying to black, make a move, is really not a useful move available. If black does pass in this situation with something like a king move, then the problem is that after capturing on e6, black would then prefer his king to be nearer the center as in the game, as we'll see. When I captured on e6, takes, rook takes e6, king f7, and this was actually more favorable than the variations we just looked at, as I was forced to drop back with the rook. But it's still quite an awkward position for black. There's still enough material on the board. Right now I'm threatening to go rook ed4, so he needs to find a way to prevent that. Rook fe8 is still impossible due to some forks on f6. King g6 looks a possible try. This fork doesn't actually work out here because he can play king f5 attacking my rook. But instead I'm able to play g4. This does set up a threat of rook takes d5 as the f5 square is covered. And then after f5 check, king h7, then the clever move rook e5 back hits the knight and the pawn on f5. So instead he made a better move, knight e7, looking to swap rooks. This is another position where it's very important for white to keep rooks on the board. Black's king is quite well placed and could actually become active in the long term, possibly could advance up the board and perhaps give some problems to white's pawns on the king side if rook starts getting swapped. And any chances of an attack, it's very important to keep material on here, which I did by playing rook d1. I think it's much stronger than rook takes d8. And I think he perhaps made another slight inaccuracy. I would actually prefer playing rook d7 here. Knights are kind of very flexible pieces, and here I would try and avoid committing his knight to a square. Rook d7 is quite useful. It covers the 7th rank, and it gives his knight options either to stay on e7 or possibly to go to d5 later. Perhaps the best continuation of white here is rook f4, but then perhaps black could consider something like f5, g4, rook g8. Even if I was to capture on f5 now, this is maybe not so great, although I've won a second pawn. My knight on h5 has got marooned somewhat on the edge of the board. Both his rooks are active. White's probably better off to play rook ef1, and is probably still winning. I'm hoping to go knight g3 to capture the pawn under favourable circumstances, but I think it was a better way to resist than knight c6 because it was a bit more limiting in terms of his knight jumps. So I continued rook e6, attacking the pawn on f6, which pretty much forces king g6. I now played g4, so again we can see how that move g4 might have been useful when I could play it earlier on when he had no good moves available. There are other good continuations available, and the computer is quite happy with this knight f4 check, but I remember quite well when I was looking at this variation of the board, I was really not so sure exactly how I would checkmate the king on g4, and I was a bit concerned that if black was able to make some exchanges in this kind of position with his king on g4, the position would be really quite unclear. In fact, white needs to play quite an accurate move, rook e3, bringing the rook back, but the main idea of this is setting up the fork knight e6, for rook fe8, knight e6, white's ready with some captures or checks, either with rook e4, rook f4, rook takes f6. And if black jumps in with the knight to cover the square on e6, then rook e7 with the threat of rook g7 is quite strong. But I think this is a much more risky line than g4, the move I played in the game, keeping more control and not kind of chase. If you're chasing your opponent's king around the board, you have to be kind of, it's useful if you really know where you're chasing it. If you're just chasing it without being clear what you're going to do, or you've chased it somewhere, particularly in an endgame, it can rebound. He continued with rook d4, which is quite a logical move, attacking my pawn on g4. After knight d4, I can drop the knight back with check and then give a check on the 7th rank, which is very strong, grabbing another pawn. Rook d4, I played another good move, rook f1, targeting the pawn on f6. Rook takes g4, knight takes f6. So I'm setting up various discovered checks here. Perhaps we can have suggestions for White's move after, if actually he went king g7, but what would be White's best move after knight d4 and yeah. So I've got a correct answer from Colin. The problem with rook d6 is that knight e2 check is a bit annoying. If White goes king d2, rook d4 swaps off rooks, which is definitely not good for me. And king b1, rook d4 is not, there is a more convincing line than that, rook d4. So correct answer for Tim. So the best move here is h5 check, because wherever black's king goes, it creates a problem. King e7, I can give check, and there's no way to prevent mate or save the rook. If the king comes up the board, then White can give check on h7 and end up defending the knight and saving an extra piece. So it's the simplest way to win. So he chose, instead of knight d4, to go king g7. So I can't capture, I don't want to capture the rook as my rook on it. His rook, as my rook on f1 is hanging. So I gave a check on h5 instead. He went back to g8 to keep his rook protected. And I went rook e f6. This is again quite a nasty move as he can't capture due to the fork on f6. Black should actually have played rook c8 here. Then White would capture the pawn on h6, threatening knight f6. Rook g2 is the best move. This is actually a little bit tricky for White to win, but the best way to continue is knight f6 check, king g7 check. Able to win his rook, so king f7 is necessary, stepping into a discovered check. But he does get to save some time by attacking my rook. But now rook d6 consolidates the extra pawn, and White should win fairly easily. Knight d4 looks the most best attempt to counterplay, but then knight e3 attacks his rook, covers c2 and diffuses things. White can play other moves here, possibly check on d7 and c3 is also another way to play. In general, it's not too good. So after rook e6, he went rook d8. So my next move caused him to resign. So perhaps we'll just have one more move in the chat for this game. A few people finding that very quickly, which doesn't altogether surprise me. Yeah, everyone's getting this one right. So the correct answer is rook takes c6, just getting my rook out of the way. And he resigned. If he captures the rook, knight f6. It will leave me a whole rook ahead. So that's the end of the first game. I'm not sure if it might be a reasonable moment to take a break.
Definitely.
Just at the, well, perhaps I'll just go through the moves again, just for anyone who hasn't seen it right from the start. I'll just run through the first few moves. So, as I mentioned, I sort of travelled directly from the French League to Linares. Of course, it was a bit of a different time. Both these games were played back in 1999. But still, the Week in Chess was already quite a reliable publication. But in general, somehow games in the French League tended to be a little bit slow at appearing. I'm not even sure, because these two games were actually played less. It was really only a few days apart, maybe not even a week. So perhaps they wouldn't even have made it even if they had been entered more earlier. So anyway, we're back at the position, which, as we saw in the last game, that Black played Queen b6 in that game. But Peter Lecco actually came up with a better move, Queen c7. The point of this move is actually to prevent the idea that I played it in the last game, knight g4, because of course now this pawn on f4 is kept in the scope of Black's queen on c7. So now, but of course the queen on b6 was quite active in terms of knight a4. So this gives White some other ideas, and I pushed on with f5. There are some other possibilities for White, but in general, White needs to act quite quickly here. Black doesn't really have any particular weaknesses, and he's ready to make lots of useful moves, bring his rooks into the game, possibly knight a4, bishop c5, swap some pieces. White needs to be quick here. f5. I mean, Peter's response was actually, I think, really not good here. Certainly at the board, I think, and after the game, we both had a very different impression of how things were going to how the computer sees the situation. I certainly felt quite confident having had the previous game, and that this seemed to be pretty dangerous for Black, and possibly my confidence, or the fact that I was playing quite quickly, also affected Peter's thoughts about the position, because in many ways his next move seems to me pretty dangerous. Perhaps we'll take a look at the alternatives first. I mean, one option for Black is to say, okay, I'm just going to try and make some exchanges and allow White to capture on e6. F takes e6. It doesn't look good to capture with the knight here because of knight f5. But Black can capture with the pawn on e6. We feel that White should be slightly better here. This pawn on e6 is a bit weak, and it has also given White's knight access to the square on g6, which could be useful at some moment. For instance, one possible line might be bishop d4, rook d5, knight g6, threatening the bishop on e7, so indirectly defending the knight on g3, which looks a little bit better for White to me. But the move that Black should actually play here is to go knight d5. This was something that we certainly considered in the game. It looks somehow, I think, very dangerous to move the knight away from the king side. It feels that there should be a useful defender here, but there's no immediate breakthrough. For instance, rook takes d5, he takes d5, knight h5, looks quite tempting, but Black is able to bring defenders over in time, bishop f6, and there's no immediate breakthrough on the king side here. In the game, I was intending just to move the bishop to d4, thinking that I would be able to continue knight h5 profitably in the future. And the only line that the line that I actually gave, looking at my old notes, was f6, which is not an especially good move. Knight g6, and this works out quite well for white. Queen takes g3 isn't possible because white's regaining the material, and now e6 is hanging. But black actually has a couple of decent moves here. Perhaps the more human choice is bishop f6. This seems quite a logical move, opposing the diagonal, and knight h5 seems like a logical response. But black can go e takes f5. This gives white the possibility to set up a fork. But now black has a typical idea in this variation to capture on b2, set up a perpetual check. White should be a bit careful not to go to c1 here, and the game could lead to a draw with queen d4 check. But what's quite surprising to me is that after rook fd8, the computer quite likes black's position. This seemed to me like a very cowl move to make, with so many white pieces apparently looking towards the black king. But it's actually very hard for white to do very much here. In general, my pieces are actually not that stable in the center. In particular, the bishop on d4, the knight on e5, they're really not so well placed. One big problem is f takes e6, which looks very logical. Black recaptures with the knight, and then this, of course, the bishop on d4 is targeted, which is a really important piece to have a successful attack. By jumping with the knight, bishop f6 reinforces the diagonal, and now there's real problems with these two pieces. They're both very loose here. There are some other ideas for white. Queen g4, again bishop f6, attacking the knight on e5, and knight h5, bishop takes e5. There isn't really much going on here. Knight takes g7, black has defensive ideas like knight f6, hitting the queen. Some other possibilities for white, say like king b1 is pretty harmless. Black can just continue with bishop f6, reinforcing the defense. So another idea which looks quite logical is rook hf1, lining up the rook on the f file. But now black actually can take the pawn on h4, and it's not only a question of losing the pawn. The problem with this is that once the pawn on h4 disappears, black has this check on g5, and this opens up other possibilities for black. For instance, here knight e3 is a strong move, forking my rooks, and if I capture, the knight on e5 is loose. I mean, one possibility for white is to go completely all in here and just start sacrificing pieces. This is not so much my style, and it probably doesn't really work, but it does look quite dangerous. So white can consider something like knight h5, e takes f5, knight takes g7, king takes. There aren't really that many dangerous discovered checks here, because black is going to be able to block the long diagonal. But just to give up another knight to get the queen in, giving a check, and then to try and bring the rook into the attack. This is reasonably dangerous, but white has given up a lot of material. Two pieces already to get here, and it's not really going to be mate. White is certainly going to cause the black king some problems for some time to go, and there are a couple of loose pawns, so there's going to be a certain amount of material regained. But in general, black should be in control. Protecting the pawn on f5 looks quite logical. I'll just show one possible line. Check, bishop g7, attacking the rook, and also the knight on d5. Queen c6, and white can actually regain the queen. But in general, white's still short a little bit of material here. Black has two rooks and a piece, and although white can collect some pawns, or possibly black might prefer to give back an exchange. In general, black's got quite a comfortable position here. So black should definitely have looked for one of these two options. And he chose instead to go e takes to f5. This was obviously a kind of tactical resource that he was looking for. He thought that he would be able to challenge my pieces, and in particular to use the rook down the e file, and possibly drop the bishop back to defend by kind of means of rook e8 and perhaps dropping the bishop back to f8 and ideas of knight e4. But in general, just as we saw in some of the variations in the last game, letting the white knight get to f5 is extremely dangerous here. So here he continued with rook f e8. Let's consider what might have happened if he played knight c e4. Perhaps we can have a suggestion for a strong move for white here. Got a suggestion of knight g7. I don't like that too much, but I think black can capture my bishop on c3, which is problematic. I don't actually really have any threats on the king side yet. I can't get my queen to g4. So that's another solution. So we're seeing people getting the right idea. Colin and Alan have the right move. So perhaps I'll continue. So I've got a suggestion of knight d7. I think that is less effective here. Let me just think of it. I think white might be able to answer that with knight takes c3. Black one. Yeah, it's the right idea, but the wrong piece. Now, rook d7 is much more forcing, and this is pretty strong. If black captures on d7, then white can just take the bishop on e7, king h8, and capture the knight on e4, leaving white with two pieces for a rook, large material advantage. There are lots of checks going on, knight g6 possibilities. After knight f6, this attacks a couple of pieces, but white can just drop the queen back to some square. After queen takes e7, knight g6 is the queen. Black goes knight takes c3. This is a bit more complicated. Knight takes e7, king h8, because both queens are hanging here, as well as the rook on d7. But the best move here is to give a check on g6, takes, and if king g8, queen e6 secures white's queen before capturing black's, or king h7, I can take, and again I get my queen away from the attack with a check. So rook d7 is a strong move there. In the game he went rook f e8. I actually think that now rook a e8 was a better move. We'll actually see why to some extent in the game. In the game, his pawn on f7 not being defended gave quite a lot of tactical possibilities for me. If I continue in the same way as in the game, with queen f3, then knight ce4 is actually a tougher defense. The computer sees this position as still quite good for white, but the lines are very tricky. I'll just show one line. Queen e3, perhaps preparing knight takes h6 sacrifice here. Knight ce4. attacking my bishop. Now the computer wanted to go knight d7. Again, the kind of interference idea. After knight c3, capture on e7 with check. But this is pretty complicated stuff. There's a check on f4, rook d2. Now black has all kinds of possibilities. One might be knight e4, queen takes, king h2, takes, takes. This is supposed to be good for white with the extra exchange, but we're talking very complicated variations. So it's clear this rook a8 was actually a much tougher defense. White would have to commit to a much more difficult course of action. In the game, after rook f8, the weakness of the pawn on f7 created a lot of possibilities for me. And I think it's clear that Peter was still a bit shell-shocked by the opening and not really making his best move. I continued with queen f3 here, which is probably the strongest move. White could also continue with queen c4. After bishop f8, white has a kind of familiar idea, rook d7, and it's not easy for black to respond to this. There are lots of ways to give mate. After takes, takes, king h7, h here, check. We can end up with some kind of mating combination like this. But knight e6 is a stronger possibility. White doesn't have anything better than swapping queens. Knight d7 is still actually quite good for white. Even in the endgame, this bishop on c3 has now become very strong, and lots of problems. The rook on d7 could also cause havoc with these minor pieces here. But queen f3 is a more ambitious and stronger move. I'm now threatening a very strong threat simply of queen g3 and knight takes h6 ideas amongst other possibilities. So he continued bishop f8, which was probably not the best move, or at least the most practical. He could have continued instead with knight ce4. So again, the best idea for white is to go rook d7. It's slightly different to the other line in that here knight takes d7, white goes knight takes h6 check, and this should lead to checkmate, although it's quite complicated. After king h7, queen f5 check is a very important check. White mates here. King h8 is a better defense. Then white goes knight takes f7 check, king h7. And there are various ways to continue here. Perhaps the simplest is to take the knight with check, g6 and h5. There's no real saving resource for black here because bishop g5 check is met by knight takes g5, also check. But black has a few other options. The one that I think was bothering me most at the board was queen c5. Black can also try the very radical queen takes c3 here. This is white should be a little bit cautious here. Just capturing the queen is not a good idea because of bishop a3 check. If king b1, rook takes e5, and black is already in pretty good shape here. Although he has a couple of pieces for the queen, there is the idea of rook d5 check. Also, knight takes d7 is on the card. Rook takes b7. There's a fork on d2. So after bishop a3, white would have to move the king to d1. And although this position should still be good for white, it's quite complicated. But white does have a better option, simply to throw in the check on e7 first, and after captures, then the queen can be taken. Knight takes d7, knight takes d7, and white is a whole queen for a rook ahead. So although there may be still some opportunities for black to fight in this position, it shouldn't be too difficult to convert. After queen c5, though, again, white has to make a decision. I'm not sure which is the most practical move here. If white goes knight d3, this is quite awkward for black because there's no way for the queen to maintain defense of the bishop on e7. But again, black can play this queen takes c3 idea, which is quite resourceful. Possibly the most practical thing for white to do now is simply to take on e7 and to emerge the exchange ahead. But this is still not completely trivial. The pawn on a2 is hanging. King b1 again isn't possible due to knight d2 check. So black would certainly have some practical chances to fight. But that's also true after b takes c3, bishop a3 check. Yeah, again here I have to be cautious. Knight b2 is probably the only good move. And then after knight takes d7, I have this queen g4 idea, g6, take on h6. And I get to take the knight on d7. But even here, after something like rook e7, queen a4, bishop d6, white's quite a lot of material ahead, but the position is still quite ragged. I can't retreat the knight to g4 because of bishop f4 check and I lose my queen. So it's like knight d3. Black would regain another piece, and still quite good possibilities to fight for black here. Another possibility for white after queen c5 is to play bishop d4. This does have the same effect of kicking the queen away from the defense of the bishop on e7. The queen can go to b4, but then a3 would really force this. So it's better for black to actually go queen a5. Again, it's not so clear how to proceed. If I take on e7 with the knight, then black has some possibilities. For instance, queen d2 check, queen takes d4 is not so straightforward. Again, there's a threat of a fork with knight d2, and some possibilities of queen d6. My knight and rook are a bit loose. So rook takes e7 is a better option, but this does mean that black is able to take on a2, threatening queen a1 mate, and b3 is the only good defense. White should be winning here, but again, it's not a position that would have made it you can feel completely comfortable at the board. There are sort of various possible tries for black. I remember I was actually looking at this line a bit during the game, and I did actually manage to come up with a reasonable solution in one position. Rook ec8 is one possible move, but white can possibly just block this with knight c4. But the position I was actually looking at was rook ed8 to attack my bishop. So perhaps we'll see if anyone can come up with the line that I was thinking about and gave an informant here. At the moment, black's threatening rook takes d4. We've got a few suggestions of bishop b2, which is interesting, but I think knight d2 might be a problem because queen b1 mate is threatened, and I'm not sure if I can. Maybe I can give checkmate before that happens. I'm not completely sure. Got a few suggestions of bishop c3, which may well be a possible defensive move, but I had a more dynamic solution here. Okay, Tony's actually come up with the idea that I was looking for. So, all right, well, perhaps I'll just show the line. So I was looking at the line rook takes f7. There's more than one good possibility here, I believe. But this is interesting. So rook takes d4, black carries out his threat. Rook takes g7. So king h8, there is white can give mate with either knight f7 or knight g6. So king f8 is forced. Rook f7. Again, the king can't go back towards the corner because the two knights combine nicely. But king e8. Rook e7 check is necessary. So again, the king can't really go back towards the king side. There's the same similar kind of mating formation. But okay, king d8. So again, knight f7 check, king f8. So perhaps we can have some suggestions for white's next move here, having played through a little bit, having moved this line forward a little bit. The queen f4 is a bit too slow because black's certainly mate, but knight 5 d6 is the line that I wanted to play. With the idea of knight d6 takes, oops, not that one, queen b7, king d8, and queen c7, mate, and black can't go king d8, the rook takes b7, mate. So a very long line, but again, I think this was probably a trickier try, this knight ce4, than the move that he played in the game, bishop f8. So perhaps we'll have a suggestion for white's next move here after bishop f8. Okay, so we're getting a few suggestions after knight takes h6 check. So how does white follow up? So queen g3, king h7, I don't think leads anywhere. Got a correct answer from Andrew. Knight d7, I think black can go knight c takes d7. So a few correct answers here. Knight G4. This kind of opens up all the diagonals on the black king side. Doesn't really matter too much, in fact, how black plays, whether he goes knight fe4, knight f6, takes, all the moves that he played in the game, knight takes g4, takes, king h7, queen f5, king g8, queen f6, because we actually reach the same position with each sequence. And actually this diagonal is completely decisive. So after king h7, well, there are various ways to win here. h5 is pretty good, but it is actually a forced mate. So I actually went queen h8 check, king g6, h5, king f5. Well, doesn't matter where black's king goes to f5 or g5, queen f6, king g4, queen f3, king g5. And bishop f6 mate would have been the conclusion. So that was the conclusion to that game. So the second game actually concluded rather more easily for me than the first, but perhaps neither was fully as convincing as I thought at the time when I re-examined them. But I hope they might have been interesting for you, and perhaps we've still got time for a few questions.
Yeah, I was amazed by the position when there were 4 knights next to each other. I can't remember exactly how far back that is, but there were 4 knights all next to each other. Keep going back. Yeah, that's it. One of the variations you looked at had 4 knights. I mean, it's incredibly complicated when there are 4 knights. I mean, I was looking at all different variations of the knight moves, and it was amazing. Interesting game. Okay, so I think we have got time for some questions if people would like to unmute and ask a question, if that's okay.
I'm curious to know, Michael, how much of a post-mortem did you have after this game, and in general, how much of a post-mortem do you have with your opponents after a game, and is it sort of token politeness and etiquette, or do you actually have a profound discussion about a key moment of the game?
Could you unmute first, if possible, Michael?
Yeah.
Sorry, not unmute. I mean unshare.
Yeah, I was wondering how to do that. Close that window. Stop share. Okay. Is that better?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's something that's changed quite a lot, I suppose, because I think, well, I don't remember in those particular 2 games, but I think it's quite possible that we had post-mortems. I mean, maybe when you win your opponent loses quite a bad game, they don't always want to have a post-mortem. But certainly back in those days, post-mortems were very common. But now that we're sort of in the computer age, I think people are now very curious about what the computer thinks. So post-mortems are a bit less common. Sometimes, people might have other commitments talking to the press or something after a game, depending upon how the tournament is. So I think post-mortems are a bit less common, but you normally exchange some comments with your opponent after the game. You may not actually go through the game together as often, but you normally comment a bit about certain variations.
Had your second opponent prepared for the game based on the first game? He knew obviously the first game had taken place.
No, that was sort of the point that perhaps I obviously didn't convey very well. That I don't think that he wasn't aware of the first game because I'd sort of played the first game, I think Sunday in the French League and gone directly to Linares from the French League. And that was the first round of the tournament in Linares where I played with Petaleko. There were probably only 3-4 games between. And back in 1999, it's not like, you know, every game on everyone's cell phone. It was very much a question of waiting things to percolate through probably to the week in chess. There was no kind of instant update on ChessBase or that many sites that covered games, in fact. So, you know, it might well have been 10 days before that game would actually have made it into the databases, which was much too late for Peter. And that was obviously why he was caught slightly by surprise in that game.
An amazing sort of opening position to reach after 16 moves where it's identical. It just seemed amazing that complexity of game could be reached twice in a week or whatever.
Well, that was why I did it for the lecture, because it's something I've been thinking about doing for a while, and it just seemed a very unusual thing and not something I've had anything even remotely similar to in my career. In Gibraltar one year, I had a couple of games with black where I had very similar opening I think in the last 2 rounds of the tour, I had a double black, but in both of the games I was suffering miserably, slightly worse in some kind of anti-martial, but these two were slightly happier memory.
Yeah, good games, very good games.
Which kind of position do you prefer, Michael? A sharp tactical position like that where you've got to do a lot of long calculation, or a more quiet strategic position where you gradually squeeze your opponent by just moving your pieces into better squares?
I think I'm probably more effective, more suited to strategic positions, but you can never, you have to be willing to play different types of position. I think my style was probably a bit sharper then. It is, 23 years ago these games were played, so quite a long time. I think now I'm probably look less for that type of position. But I'd studied quite a lot. At that time, I'd looked quite a lot at those lines from the white side and thought I had quite a good knowledge and understanding of those kind of positions. So probably I was more willing to go for sharper positions where I felt I really had a good idea of the concepts behind it.
In the bulk of your life, you've played 1e4, haven't you? Whereas in some ways, d4 with your style. In some ways, I'm surprised you didn't play it more often. You play it sometimes, don't you? But e4 is your number one move, isn't it?
Yeah, I played e4 a lot. Well, I don't know. I think you can. I think it's more stylistic. I mean, I think you can develop any move in your own style. I think in e4 you have a lot of options with e4 as well. Now you see people playing e4 in a much more cagey way. I think they often don't play so sharply, but look to get sort of small advantages or control the position and not go for very long, sharp theoretical lines. There aren't so many guys who are actually going for these very sharp lines these days, and those that do are normally very capable tacticians.
And you don't play fianchettos with black very often, do you? G6 and bishop G7.
Yeah, that was I never really liked that too much. I did play the Benko Gambit for a while, which I quite liked, but when I played it, everyone kept on refusing to take the pawn, which seemed like a very good deal to me, and then they just started taking the pawn, which was always the thing that worried me the most about the Benko Gambit.
Michael, in the first couple of with a couple of games you demonstrated tonight, you said that you've done a lot of work to get a good understanding of the position. Roughly how many games would you study to get to a level where you think you're comfortable with with that level of knowledge?
I think it's a question of sort of being familiar with the ideas more than a particular number of games that you're looking to have an idea about where your pieces want to go, and also the kind of the nature of play, and also the kind of black resources. A lot of the ideas that I showed with the loose pawn on a2, with black being able to swap pieces early and neutralize white's initiative, and the idea that it's a very kind of temporary advantage that white has. It's a lead in development, and you need to use that quickly or translate it into something else, rather than just it's not a situation where if you play slowly, black's position is quite sound and he will just develop his pieces into quite a solid position.
Michael, do you play on chess.com or live chess, perhaps under a pseudonym just for fun, or do you only play serious games?
I don't play very much, no. No, I play occasionally, but not very often. I'm not so into online play. I stopped quite a long time ago, and I haven't actually got back into it during this pandemic period. But I'm not really missing it so much. I kind of prefer over the board play. I played a few of the kind of official competitions, but I haven't played too much. A few tournaments like that, but not. I haven't played many games on my own. And normally when I did, it was because I had some event coming up, and I thought maybe it was worth just trying a few blitz games just to try and get a bit warmed up, as I haven't been playing much, obviously.
When you first started playing, how many hours a day did you study a lot, or was it all natural? And how did that change through your life then, as you?
I did well when I was young. I played a lot. I think I probably read a reasonable number of chess books when I was young as well. I think I certainly had periods when I was working quite hard in my late 20s, early 30s. Certainly, I think then I was working quite a lot of hours, but it's hard to maintain a really disciplined approach as time goes on.
Would that have been like 6 hours a day or something? You know, you sit up, you get up.
At one time, I might have been doing that kind of work, particularly before the FIDE knockout events. They were all. When I was really a sort of contender in the World Championship cycle. That was when I was at my most motivated to do work, and I was getting to the later stages and being.
You lost to an end.
Sorry,
you lost to an end, didn't you, in the final, or was it?
Yeah, I mean, I had a few good runs in Groningen. I played against Anand, which was actually the final of the tournament, and then he played the match with Karpov after he beat me. And I also lost to him again in the semi-final in Delhi when he beat Shirov in the final. I also got to the sort of semi-final in Vegas where I lost to Akopian, and I lost in the final against Kazimzhanov in Tripoli in Libya. So there were quite a few around that period when there were a lot of those events happening. That was probably when I was working at my peak, I would say.
Hence why you were number 4 in the world, I think has been quoted many times.
Yeah, around that time I was, regularly top 10 in the world for a period. So that was where I would say when I was doing my best work.
A common question that's come up in the past, I've probably asked it a few times, is have you any advice or ideas for how we can improve English/British chess in general? And obviously I'm talking about the medium long term with juniors and general chess development. Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm sort of reasonably optimistic about how things are going, really, because there's just a lot more chess in schools at the moment. This is the Chess in Schools charity, and I think there's just a lot more players coming along. And I think that particularly if you have a group of strong players who can play against each other and help each other to develop. That's a very useful thing. That often when we've done well in England, it's been a group of players who have come along at the same time and they've learnt from each other playing against each other. I think that is still useful. It's a lot more international world now than it used to be, but I think that can help. And I think when you have some players who set a kind of new level, then that really encourages others that it's possible to get to that level. When you haven't had a period of not having strong players for a long time, I think people can be more content with a level that isn't so high and just isn't really that competitive internationally. And there's certainly a lot more strong players working in coaching now as well. So, you know, I think that's quite a positive development. I'm not exactly sure that it's easy to say how to improve things greatly without huge amount more resources. I think the ECF is doing a pretty good job with the resources it has at the moment, really.
Have you ever lost a game in the British Championship? I've been playing. I've never seen you actually lose a game.
Yeah, no, I lost quite a few games. I mean, the first few years I played, I wasn't especially strong, but I did have a very long run of not losing classical games. Certainly, I lost a game to Lincoln McShane in the playoff in Hull, but I think in classical games, the last game I lost was to Stuart Conquest, I think in Blackpool, like 1980 sometime, 1989 or something. It is a very long.
More or less.
It's completely implausible. I mean, I've been assuming this run would end for so long now. I've almost forgotten about the whole thing. But yeah, I can't imagine it going on much longer. But who knows?
Quite a record.
Of course, I often avoided losing by just not participating, which is a very effective technique. But I have played quite a few games in the interim, even allowing for some of the British Championships that I skipped.
Paul, did you have a question? You got your hand up?
No, I've had my question. Sorry.
All right, take your hand down then.
Yeah, well, I will.
Anyone else got any questions?
A quick question, if I may, going back to the amount of work. If a club player, say, has 2 or 3 hours a week, or possibly less, what would you recommend they study with a view to improve their results?
I would try and look at your own games. I think that's the most effective way to study. I think the key moments in your games, they're actually more, they'll tell you a lot more than you can get from watching any video or course or book. It seems to me that the moments that you find difficult in a game, they're the moments which I think are really important to try and, if you can try and understand what you found difficult there and how to do better in those moments in the future. I think that's a very important area to work on. And you know, you can also work with the computer, but I think it's important to remember to understand what you thought of the game, be clear on what your thought process was during the game, and maybe then to look at it with the computer or in different ways. Just going over the whole game with the computer, I'm not sure is always as important. I'm normally with top players, they'll be focused on 3 or maybe a few questions they had about moments in the game, and they'll be interested in the computer's opinion there. They'll be slightly less, they'll want to see the game in general to see if there's some glaring omission that they haven't noticed. But if there isn't, they'll mainly be focused on those key moments that they were unsure what to do, or they were looking at 2 different continuations and found it difficult to make a decision. I think that's a very important area. The data you have about yourself is quite important.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, it only remains for me to say thank you very much, Michael, for joining us a second time. It's been fascinating going through the games and the questions and answers, and I'm sure we'll all agree that we've enjoyed it tonight. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Good night.